Hi, I'm Father Joseph Mary, and welcome back to A Simple Word, where we reflect on the gospel for the coming Sunday. In ancient Christianity, there was a certain monk named Telemachus. This monk decided that he would live in imitation of the desert fathers and became a hermit. So for many years, he lived a life of prayer, peace, and solitude. But as time wore on, the more he prayed with the scriptures, Telemachus began to notice that Jesus spoke over and over about love of neighbor, about caring for the sick, feeding the hungry, forgiving sinners. Yet here he was living a life of peaceful solitude. He decided that to be faithful to the gospel, he had to go among the people and live a life of service. So Telemachus embarked immediately for the greatest city in the world, Rome. By this time, Christianity had spread all through the empire, and the followers of Christ were no longer killed in the gladiator games of the Roman Colosseum. But the games continued to exist, and they drew massive crowds. Only now it was criminals and prisoners of war who were killed in the brutal arena instead of the Christians. Upon arriving in Rome, Telemachus was horrified to find such large numbers of Christians among the 80,000 people who packed the Colosseum to watch the bloodbath. So at once he forced his way into the stadium. He leapt onto the arena floor and he stood in protest between the gladiators and their prey. The crowd booed and demanded the fight begin. Roman soldiers pushed the old hermit aside. But before the fighting could start, Telemachus once more dove between the gladiators and demanded that the Christian people come to their senses. Once more, the old man was shoved aside. The crowd booed and hissed and threw fruit at the old hermit. Finally, unable to be heard over the roar of the crowd, Telemachus literally threw himself on the floor between the gladiators. And he stood up and he cried out, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command these wicked games to cease. Do not offend God's mercy by shedding innocent blood." But the crowds roared even louder in protest. A Roman soldier drew his axe and brought it down, crashing into the skull of Telemachus. And he fell to the floor of the arena, instantly dead. And a sudden hushed silence fell over the Colosseum as the people began to realize what they'd done. They'd killed a holy man. And slowly the shamed spectators began to leave the Colosseum one by one, never to return. Telemachus was the last blood ever spilled in the Colosseum. The next day, the Roman Emperor Honorius decreed a ban on all gladiator fights. One man changed the history of an empire. In Sunday's Gospel, Matthew picks up right where he left off last week, following the parable of the sower. Jesus tells three more parables in quick succession: the weeds and the wheat, the mustard seed, and the yeast mixed with flour. These parables are incredibly dense and they're packed with meaning, so we're only going to look at the abridged option in the lectionary, the parable of the weeds and the wheat. In order to grasp the meaning of the parable, we have to hear it with the ear of the first century Jew living in Palestine, a largely agricultural people with a rich sense of their own history. Because in this parable, Jesus is providing a summary of human history. He's telling the people why things are the way they are. Why is there evil in the world? Why do people suffer? And to what end will good and evil come? He begins, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a man who sowed good seed in his field." Now they just heard the parable of the sower. So the audience knew that the sower was God and the field was God's creation. And Jesus continues, "While everyone was asleep, his enemy came and sowed weeds all through the wheat and then went off." Again, Jesus is using an image that's very familiar to the Jewish people and a situation which was not at all uncommon. This was actually done as an act of vengeance upon an enemy, to sow weeds in his field with the intent of destroying his harvest. It was so common that Roman law provided strict punishment for such an offense. Now, listening, we might think, how bad could that really be? We could just go out and pick the weeds, right? I mean, all of us can discern the difference between a weed and a flower. But the word being used in Greek isn't really weeds. It's zizani, and it's referred to a plant called bearded darnel. In its earliest stage, it so closely resembled good wheat, even the most experienced farmer couldn't tell the two apart. The Jews called it bastard wheat, and the Greek is from the Hebrew zunim, which is a form of the word zana, meaning fornication. Again, we have to understand the Jewish mind. The popular belief was that in the time of wickedness, which preceded the great flood, all of creation went astray. Flora and fauna alike committed fornication and gave birth to corruption in nature. So it's not so much that the zunim are weeds, but rather they're wheat that's been corrupted. And every farmer knew that the bearded darnel, this corrupt wheat, couldn't be safely separated from the good wheat. Because by the time the two were beginning to flower and they became recognizable, their roots were already intertwined. If you pulled up one, you uprooted the other. So the separation didn't actually happen until the time of harvest. After the threshing, the grain was set out on large trays and field hands were hired to carefully pick out the good wheat from the corrupt darnel. The good wheat was stored in the barn. The corrupt was destroyed by fire. So what is Jesus trying to teach his disciples with this parable? In a broad sense, he's outlining the drama of history, and he's addressing the question at the heart of the human condition. In what does evil originate, and why do we suffer? But he's also warning us of the dangers of human judgment. Even the most experienced farmer can't discern good wheat from corrupt. And so the Christian had better tread with fear and trembling in judging the heart of another person. Because we're very quick to judge and condemn. We're quick to assign guilt and blame. We're quick to make assumptions based on a person's appearance, or to assign hidden motives behind their words and actions. Be very careful, because you can't see the heart. You can't see the sufferings they're going through, the hidden crosses they're carrying, or their individual cooperation or rejection of grace. Only God can see those things. Do not judge, because only the harvest will reveal the true quality of the wheat. But in a deeper spiritual sense, we also recognize that the field is the human heart of the individual, because we're all sinners. There is in all of us a constant struggle against corruption. In all of us, there's the striving towards virtue and that downward pull of concupiscence. That's the ultimate goal of our lives, to uproot our pride and our selfishness and to bear fruit in holiness. And people who do that change the world. John Paul II, Mother Teresa, Telemachus. Holiness can change the history of an empire. And we need that witness today more than ever. I'm Father Joseph Mary. Thanks for listening to A Simple Word. If you found this reflection helpful, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.